It's my pleasure this morning to introduce you to Dr. Catherine Keller. Dr. Keller practices theology as a relation between ancient hints at ultimacy and current matters of urgency. As the George T. Cobb Professor of Constructive Theology at Drew University, she teaches courses in process, political, and ecological theology. Within and beyond Christian conversation, she has all along mobilized the transdisciplinary potential of feminist, philosophical, and pluralist intersections with religion. Her most recent books, the ones that you will want to purchase after today if you don't have them already, are at once contemplative and social embodiments of our entangled difference. Those titles include Facing Apocalypse, Climate, Democracy, and Other Last Chances, as well as Political Theology of the Earth, Our Planetary Emergency, and the Struggle for a New Public. Dr. Keller is a longtime and beloved community member here at St. Paul and St. Andrew. We are so very fortunate that she is generous with her expertise and wisdom. Let's welcome Dr. Keller.
Today, I just want to think with you about how human flourishing is utterly inseparable from the flourishing of the earth. That which we all have in common, we all of us humans, but all of us non-humans as well. All of the birds and the bees. So human flourishing, uncommonly good, and sadly not nearly common enough. You know, so when we think about the earth theologically, we usually get back to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, back to the beginning, not surprisingly, because there's quite a lot going on, a whole bunch of beginnings before the human beginning gets off the ground. Terrible phrase that, isn't it? Off the ground. Yeah, now we're in a civilization that's really off the ground in all kinds of scary, creepy ways, really getting dissociated from the ground. Well, that's what we're wanting to think about. And that sense of common good there and flourishing, how do we tug it in to that which we have in common with all the creatures of the earth, to that creation that, at least for us, is very centrally the creation of the earth. There may be a million or a billion times a billion other centers in this universe or multiverse. The more we learn about it, the more we know. It's just much bigger than we can begin to imagine, and probably the other intelligences out in there are too, but we don't know. So we need to stay grounded here rather than, arrange with Musk to get transported to another planet before things get too bad here. So I'm glad that Andrea started us with the tree, a tree not flourishing. Yeah, that's a sadly appropriate image, that tree not flourishing. And it helps to get us back into Genesis 1 and 2. And that tree, I mean, it's interesting that the first sin was about taking an apple from the tree. I'm a feminist theologian, so a lot of my earlier theological energy probably went into defending Eve, Chava, the mother of life, against all the sexist, misogynist projections onto her. But that's not my agenda at the moment. just noting, it's interesting that from the point of view of the text, it was the the wrongful taking of an apple, why it was wrong, we don't know why that was prohibited, but that we know that that tree and its fruit were being preserved, conserved. They were off limits. And it's the plucking of a tree in a way that was apparently bad for the whole garden that then begins all of our troubles as humans. It's as though this wrongful use of a bit of a non-human creature, a tree, then gets us just thrown out of the garden, a great metaphor for what we call paradise, but that's itself its own kind of metaphor, isn't it? But for an utterly whole, utterly interconnected life. Oh, the life that's in you is the life that's in me. And in that garden, the you and the me probably include all of the trees and all of the flowers and all of the beasts and all of the divine presence that go into that flourishing. Oh, by the way, I had to check it out, but the root of flourishing, the etymology is flourishing. It's, you know what it is? Flower. Yeah, I had forgotten that. Flora. So it's especially nice, to keep that botanical sense of flourishing in view as we think about what's gone and is going so wrong with our flourishing, with human flourishing on this planet that is so much more than human. That much more in the biblical narrative is, first of all, there even before our world as we know it gets shaped. It's there in the form of the deep. Well, it's there in all the content of Genesis 1:2, that the earth was tohu vabohu, yes, that's the Hebrew, and darkness was upon the face of the tehom, and the Spirit of God was fluctuating. Yes, that's very wingy, very vibrant over the face of the oceanic waters. So that's a lot going on before what we consider our world took shape. But what's so strange is that theology, by the 3rd century, by the late 3rd century, kind of erased that whole second verse by going into what's called the creatio ex nihilo. You know that phrase? Creation from nothing. Creation from nothing. I mean, that's absolute dogma then for almost a couple thousand years of every kind of Christianity, that God created everything from nothing. That's why I had to write a book called Face the Deep. Like the second verse of the Bible is supercharged with nothing, and that's all there. Well, I think this is relevant to our ecological circumstance, because that strange erasure of a text right at the beginning of the most important and influential book of our civilization, the erasure of its second line, has everything to do with our inability to live with the sometimes chaotic complexity of the non-human, and actually a kind of chaos or tohu vabohu that's all about potentiality. There's nothing wrong with it. I would say it's before and beyond good and evil, but it is the very potentiality for everything we call good, and it's all there, vibrating, pulsating, and ready to emerge from that tehom, that deep, which, by the way, is the Hebrew translation of the Sumerian Babylonian word Tiamat, which was the goddess that is the source of all that is, the goddess out of whose womb comes the universe. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? I wrote a lot about that in my book, too. that there's any, that, you know, it's not that the writers of Genesis were secretly declaring goddess worship. No, no, no. That was way pagan associated. But they are mindfully, they knew the prior languages, they are mindfully letting that hint through of that deep Tiamat connection, that Tehom, that deep of bottomless potentiality that God then calls forth the creation from. But instead, we have an image of a kind of creation that's really not very biblical, but that's just this kind of commanding of things to come forth out of nothing at all. You know, so I guess it makes it an all the more, you know, like hyper omnipotent deity if there's nothing at all there. But that's not the text. It's a much more relational interaction of calling forth and then saying, oh, that's good. That's good. Wow, nice, right? It's like God is so a little positively surprised at just what is coming forth at each moment. Because there is, it seems, a kind of spontaneous relationality at just every level of the creation, and perhaps of what precedes what we call the creation. So it's not from nothing. It's from a kind of potentiality that is unruly, that is still unformed, that then gradually takes shape. And as it takes shape, the order gets more and more complex, the order gets more and more beautiful, and these humans are arriving rather early on the scene in the first chapter, and are granted Radah, dominion. I'm not going to say that's too bad, but what's too bad is how badly that dominion has been interpreted, especially in the last several centuries that we count as modernity, but in all that moved up to this sense that what Radah means, this biblical dominion, is actually a kind of mere top-down royal dominance, like something all-controlling. So you get this image of the all-controlling God creating from a nothing. It's not biblical. And then that gets developed into the human reflecting that God, and in a way that I think is also profoundly unbiblical. That dominion over all the other creatures gets gradually turned into, you know, the right to exploit and use up at will, the right to knock out of existence, the right to knock into extinction. This is the very species that God had called forth with such delight. So it's a deep misinterpretation that developed, sometimes in very direct ways, really emphasizing that dominion as control, sometimes a little more indirect. But all the time, there's, of course, the chance of interpreting it differently, interpreting it in terms of what's called stewardship. And that's a very important bit of vocabulary for Christian ecological work. Now, I was looking at this book, I had to bring it along, Sharon Delgado, United Methodist pastor, who wrote The Cross in the Midst of Creation. And she says that I really did criticize that notion of stewardship, and I guess I remember doing that. Because and she agrees with me that the notion of stewardship is still too anthropocentric. It's too centered on the human beings and our kind of superior knowledge and ability to take charge and control. And of course, that's mostly how it gets interpreted. I don't think we can afford to give up stewardship because it's biblical language and because the people we're trying to get to are the ones we can get to because of biblical hints that help us move towards a better future for our corner of the creation. So that sense of radah, dominion, is what we're always going to be involved in reinterpreting. Can't erase it, unfortunately. Can't erase it, but we can emphasize dominion is meant as stewardship. What does that mean? Well, what could it mean except responsibility, ability to respond with care, with some of the appreciation that God showed for all the creatures. Ooh, it is good. That would be part of dominion. It's admiring the beauty of all the non-humans and therefore treating them with the respect due fellow creatures and with some sense of actual care in the way we use them, even though we have to eat some of them. The way and I'm not a total vegan by any means, but of course there are huge disparities between the different ways that we can handle our food needs. And responsibly and caringly, or the very opposite, surely exploitatively, the ugly sense of dominion, where it seems to no longer have to do with responsible stewardship. So interestingly, The Cross in the Midst of Creation by Sharon Delgado has this powerful image, and I just want to read it in her language. The air, water, land, and stable climate necessary for sustaining life are being destroyed by the institutional imperatives of today's corporate-dominated global empire. Oh, that sums up the causes. This cannot be the plan or design of the God of love, the God of creation. And now the phrase, creation itself is being crucified. In this dying of Earth's life systems, her children, both human and other than human, suffer. Songs of praise become cries of pain and lament. My God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, she goes on to argue that God has not forsaken us. God is here experiencing the desecration of the earth with us and still calling us to do what we should be doing, what we can be doing, what we need to be doing. So creation is being crucified as the one we center our faith in also was crucified. And we can say in both crucifixions, that of Jesus and that of the creation, no, that is not the will of God. God didn't send Jesus down to get crucified. Jesus came down to live fully and divinely human life, to live that life among us to the fullest. And yes, that would be at such risk because of the critique of the empire of that time, such risk that of course he wasn't going to survive long. So yes, no doubt his death was predictable before he was born. That doesn't mean he came down to die, to be crucified, any more than the creation was created in order to be crucified. It's created in order to be appreciated, loved, cared for. And yeah, so that's not where we are. And we're facing into those deep systemic, economic power causes of the degradation of the earth. And it's a way that puts puts the future of the planet on the line next week? No, we're going forth together no matter what happens next week, and together with the other creatures of the earth. But we do recognize there's going to be, if it all goes one way, a kind of unprecedented level of threat to the future of the planet because of all of the promised undoings of all of the environmental legislation that has been very inadequate, but that it is a hell, yes, a hell of a lot better than the hellishness that will come if it's undone. So it's a creepy moment for all of the species of the world, not just in this country, because unfortunately our economy, is most powerful on the planet. And so how we behave ecologically is the biggest influence in terms of climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And now we have had the warmest summer on record since 1850. That was true last summer, 23. It was true now in the summer of 24. Those stats are in. One more warmest summer on record. Right, 81 degrees is predicted for Halloween. So there we are, standing by that cross in the midst of creation. So this is why, of course, for some time, liberation theology does not any longer ignore the non-human. It did for a while, like in the late 60s, the 70s, maybe into the 80s, a lot of it did. Just, it's like, how can you worry about black bears up in North America when, millions of folk in Latin America are on the brink of starvation and are being threatened by military violence if they resist. Okay, right, right. So there's a lot that goes on in the world, and that liberation theology has been so brilliantly, world-changingly attuned to, that's fully human and requires very full focus. So it took a while before liberation thinkers began to make the connection and make it systematically. Sobrino probably first of all, then Leonardo Boff, who was the first I knew about, and then Ivona Gabarra, whose work I love, because she brings in ecofeminism into her work on eco-social justice. And the notion of eco-social justice really developed. The point wasn't to shift from the focus on social justice and issues of human oppression into the question of the oppression of the non-human. No, but to see that the life in the non-human is the life in us, and vice versa, that we are truly profoundly entangled, and that humans aren't going to be able to thrive without a thriving non-human environment, because the environment isn't just something out there around us, it's what we're made of. And unfortunately for it, it's increasingly made up of our contributions. But liberation theology did shift into that rich sense that the liberation of the human is inseparable from the liberation of the non-human. And of course, then it's not accidental that someone with a Latin American and liberative background who happened to have become the Pope wrote then Laudate Si, coming out of his Argentinian experience. So, and Francis's subtitle for Laudate Si, praise you, is care for the common home. So we're back to that common, that uncommonly common good. And that shift of liberation theology into really affirming the struggle on behalf of the non-human is critical for any chances we have because of the enormous population and its influences that are Roman Catholic, much, of course, also in the global South. And it's not just liberation theology and its Catholic sources that have focused strongly on eco-theology. The theology that I went to study, as always a Protestant, is called process theology, and I went to work with its main theological progenitor, John Cobb, whose birthday I hope to celebrate with him in February when he turns 100. He won't promise me he's going to be there for the birthday party. I said, well, John, I have to get my flight ticket pretty soon. That's, you know, in California, you're going to have to promise soon. So he started already in the late 60s, one of the very first Christian theologians. Not the only one, not the only Protestant, but almost, to recognize the connections. He wrote a book that came out, I think, in '71 called Is It Too Late? It's second edition, still very readable and very short. Is it too late? And he still won't say that it is too late. A lot closer. It's too late for a whole lot of species that might have made it if we had shifted course half a century ago. But it's not too late to have a habitable, meaningful, and in many ways beautiful future for us earthlings. And, you know, I'd love to go on and on with you about what process theology is, but instead I'm going to look at the time. Help me with time. When should I stop?
When you're done.
You're going to wish you didn't say that. No, not really. So what I will say about process theology is that it's the one theology that more than any other systematically connects the life that's in you to the life that's in me, to the life that is in everything that is in planet, and all of it part of the life of God, and the life of God part of the life of all of us. It's just process theology is coming out of a philosophy of radical entanglement, interconnectedness, that nothing in the universe is anything at all apart from everything in its world. The closer, the more influential. But even distant galaxies are not completely irrelevant, not completely, because they're part of the same system. It's a theology that comes from the work of Alfred North Whitehead, who was one of the great mathematicians of the earlier 20th century, and who then was early on to get what quantum physics and Einstein relativity were up to, and realized our civilization's not barely ready for this, and yet there's an insight here that we really need. So he left his job in mathematics in London and came to the US, where he could work on this worldview. Just to summarize it, that everything that is, every creature, every entity, whether it's you or whether it is an electron in your body, every creature is interrelated with all the other creatures of its environment. And it is an event. Every creature is an event of becoming. So we are all events of interrelated becoming. So I'm not exactly the same person, not exactly, as when I started this talk, and not just because I'm going through some notes, but because I can feel your presences and feel you feeling me, right? Mostly unconscious, but that's now part of who I am. In this view, we're becoming part of each other all the time, sometimes more influentially than other times, and it can't be erased. Other influences can come in and relativize some influences, that's good, but it all becomes part of who we are. Our relationships are the content of us, and yet we have a kind of freedom to interpret those relationships. Moment by moment, there is a spontaneity, a freedom, a choice. The electron has some, remember quantum indeterminacy? That's part of what Whitehead was getting. What we call freedom goes all the way down, that there's an element of something like a decision, a choice that gets made at the quantum level, and much more freedom at our level, fortunately and unfortunately, given the history that follows that plucked apple. So process theology, just more than any other theology, has emphasized for, half a century the ecological interdependence of all that we are, so that everything, not just human things, are social by nature. So when we say eco-social, it's not natural ecology and human sociality. It's the ecological sociality of humans and all the other creatures, and all of us as somehow members one of another. All of us members one of another. Now, those of us who are members of a church are perhaps members one of another in a privileged way. I don't mean because we're superior or because we're more likely to go to heaven than but in a distinctive sense, because, we do have some texts that call us to that consciousness. So there's a kind of awareness that we have as a gift and a responsibility to hold that interconnectedness of us all, that sense of being members of a body, to hold that all together. And what process theology has emphasized is what we call Christ is not just that which is obviously embodied one time in one body, and not just that which is embodied in the body of Christ as the church. For process theology, there's an element of that Christ, that logos word, the cosmic word from the beginning of John that's in all things, without which nothing is that is. There's an element of that Christ in every creature at every moment, calling, like the calling of God in the very beginning. But there's that element of Christ in everything that together makes up the creation. And it calls, it doesn't control. And that's the thing about the process God. It's not a God who is in control. Not in control. Otherwise, we probably never would have had to leave the garden. Nothing would have gone wrong. No, the process God is not in control. That would be deadly boring for God, who is tuned in, aware of everything. What, no surprises? Just control, big puppeteer in heaven? No, this is a God calling forth creatures with increasing levels of freedom and indeterminacy, who make increasingly complex and interesting decisions. And God is calling for that complexity and then taking it in. And in some way, in that endless spiral of love, calling us further, calling us to heal what has gone wrong through our choices, calling us to build on what goes right. But a lot has gone wrong with our choices for the whole material planet in which we live. And I won't get into more process theology now, except to say it's possible that a theology that helps us to really stay mindful of our interdependence with each other, with every element of our bodies, with the air that we're breathing, with the light flickering in, with everything, that theology that helps keep us conscious of that interdependence that sense in which the life that's in you is the life that's in me, that might help us be more motivated to make the needed changes to rescue our environment. So moving towards something like a closure, what about some hopes? Well, I had about 4 that they seem kind of specific, not the 4 hopes, but 4 examples of hope that I am aware of, that I'm feeling right now. One is just, a bit of news. I'm glad to learn that we are not in a surge. So environmentalists have now agreed that the acceleration of climate change is going on. And it just keeps going on. It's been accelerating since 1850, not just more and more climate change, but the rate has been accelerating. That's continuing. That's not the good news. That's nightmarish. But this year, there is not an acceleration of that rate of change. So the rate of change is going on, and it contains its own acceleration. But the acceleration is not accelerating. So there's a steadiness to the rate this year, and that had not been the case for most of this, for perhaps all of this century. So this new study was just published in the journal Nature Communications, Earth and Environment, and I'll just read that it confirms the broad consensus that the planet is getting warmer, but at a statistically steady rate, not at a sufficiently accelerated rate that could be statistically defined as a surge. So recent years have seen record-breaking temperatures and heat waves globally. 23, the warmest year, of course, on record since 1850 by a wide margin. And the 10 warmest years on historical record have taken place in the last 10 years. That's remaining the case. That's not me sharing any good news. The good news that this year, the rate is not accelerating. So if the nightmare shift doesn't happen next week, maybe there's some chance of pushing to slow that acceleration further. The second example of some hope, the majority of the US population kind of gets it with climate change now. 8 in 10 Americans support funding for climate research. 8 in 10. And 3/4 support government regulation. That surprises me. That's a good thing. I hope that shows up in the vote. The third little bit of hope, New York State. Maybe you heard about this. It's just news, I think yesterday morning I caught it. New York State is mounting a lawsuit. It is suing big oil. So our state is suing big oil for reckless endangerment of non-responsible populations. New York, therefore, is suing big oil, and these prosecutors could press criminal charges against big oil for its role, I'm reading here from their text, in fueling hurricanes and other climate disasters. And this new prosecution memorandum has been endorsed by elected officials across our state. It's a 50-page document published by consumer advocacy group Public Citizen. And this is coming as the U.S. is struggling to recover from deadly hurricanes in the southeast. Helena, Milton, we know those are, the scientists tell us, those are certainly exacerbated by climate crisis. New York was hit hard by Ida in the 21 and 12, Hurricane Sandy, I remember that one. So deadly climate events have come up here to the Northeast as well. So that's cool that a bunch of prosecutors are taking on big oil, and hopefully they can tap some of the serious economic resources that our city does potentially provide. And another hope, the United Methodist Church. So the most recently adopted and most comprehensive statement on the climate that the UMC has made in the Book of Resolutions from 2016 is called Climate Change and the Church's Response. And it calls United Methodists to study the bishop's resources from 10 years earlier to, quote, explore lifestyle changes as individuals and faith communities support those impacted by fossil fuel extraction and need to change to sustainable forms of energy. So I won't go on with the statement, but statements can be powerful. They, of course, can also be ignored. The real test of any statement is, what people do with it, what United Methodists do with it. We're doing something with it, and that's good news. I mean, we've come up with a statement, and it is being reinforced, and we as a community might find more that we can also do to support this policy that fortunately is already part of our church. And this is all to give courage, these hopes aren't to reassure us that things are going to be okay. They aren't that kind of hopes, are they? Karl Barth, a theologian I rarely quote because he was so orthodox, but there's one quote of his that I use all the time, the only one, and it's that Christians are neither optimistic nor pessimistic. We are hopeful. Okay, Bart, amen. So I think we can have hope. This is hope in the prophetic sense that's shadowed by great systemic tragedies and injustices and environmental degradations that the Israelites suffered, and warnings. But hope as a public force field is a contribution of the prophetic tradition to our civilization. So this is hope that we can work creatively, co-creatively with the chaos, which is no longer just that neutral or good chaos of the pre-creation moment, the tohu vabohu and the deep. It's got a lot of really ugly chaos that is the result of the systemic, indeed, truly, in every sense, corporate greed and exploitation that our species, and especially its 1% directing the rest, has imposed on the planet. So the chaos is an ugly thing in as much as it's the effects of environmental damage. But I think that our faith, if it isn't faith that God's going to step in and do it for us, but rather faith that, God is there, the Word, the Logos, is there calling us, luring us, giving us hints, feeding us intuitions, giving us glimpses of what's possible, what's really possible in the spirit of the living God, and just the beauty. When I picked this leaf up on the way to church, it was still gorgeous. It's interesting how it dried up so fast, whereas it was lying there on the ground being beautifully red. But even as it crumbles into the tohu vabohu, it's just to remind that even when things get very bad, systemically, ecologically, politically, the beauty is there. Let it feed you. Let it nurture you, and that spirit of the living God. Let it be with you, and every age and race and clime, CLIME. I don't know that the authors in 1935, Tweedy was thinking of climate change, but we can. Shall blend their creeds in one. Yes, we need solidarity. And earth shall form one family. Amen? Yes.
Yeah, if we have a little bit of time for a few questions, so if anybody has one top of mind right now as opposed to later, which is going to happen to me at about 3:30, right? I'll be like, oh, which I think email is good for. Anybody have one right now? All right, coming to you.
Yeah, Catherine, thank you, as always. If the New York State lawyers, quote unquote, win their case, what could possibly be the outcome? Would it be just a cash settlement, which would be nothing? Or would be there some way of coercing the oil industry to change their pace and their focus?
It's a great question, and I haven't seen the actual document yet. I think it probably is available, but my understanding is that it will be at least a cash settlement, which then will go directly into environmental work, and supposedly it will be a big cash settlement. But the goal is to demand changes in those very policies that then require a cash settlement, or else the direct follow-up would be further charges, and a follow-through lawsuit. But there is not a mechanism for New York State to actually control the operation of multinational corporations that, are, I mean, there's not a mechanism in place in the United States that can quite do that. But because of the expense and then the explicit intent to follow through if the same damages continue to be perpetrated, there's the hope. And clearly it would be money that speaks more than anything else to these corporations. It's a delicate hope. But at least it's going right at the capitalist monetary sources of the degradation that we're suffering. And hopefully it'll get more publicity too and be educational.
I'm coming to you, David. Oh, you don't want me to come to you. Okay, Kate.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for naming Alfred North Whitehead. You know, in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, I'm sure you know, Alice B. Toklas, she said that Gertrude Stein said, I've met three geniuses in my life. The first, a bell went off. Pablo Picasso, Alfred North Whitehead, and Virginia, and Gertrude Stein. That's, yeah. But Alfred North Whitehead is my muse, my source as a teacher. I don't know Aims of Education, if you've read. Yes, absolutely. This, so the pulse, and so I have no question except that I never knew about process theology. Never, and also feel like the romance that he talks about in the chaos and then the romance of discovery and play is the romance, the relation. The romance is love, yes?
All right, hold on.
Well, great, and I'm so glad to make this deep connection, yes, this Whiteheadian connection of connectivity. And romance, I love bringing that metaphor in. The word that Whitehead uses for divine will, for the way God influences each creature at each moment, the word is lure, the divine lure, not just call, which would be a little more directly biblical. Lure has a slightly seductive element. It has a kind of romantic tone to it. It's clearly a calling, an invitation, but it's trying to stir some desire. So it's not just about do the right thing, but you might love this. Do the right thing. It might be risky, it might be costly, but it might be what you most deeply desire. So there is an element of romance in the divine relationship to the universe in Whitehead, but it's both in the lure, the call, and for nerds, that's the primordial nature of God. And the consequent nature of God is this. So at the beginning of any moment of existence of any creature, there's that lure that is interacting with the whole world of influences, and our spontaneity of decision happens. Then what? Well, then this God takes us in. God takes in everything that happens in the universe. That is, God feels it. This is not the unmoved mover. This is what Charles Horton called, right? You said it. The most moved mover. That God is moving, not just in the sense of being affected, but having some feeling. God is moved by everything that happens. It's the opposite of unmoved, of the distant sort of patriarchal, indifferent one who just thinks we should do the right thing. No, this is God calling and luring that we do the right thing, not just because it's good, but also because it's true and because it's beautiful, desirable. And God takes in what we do with that, feels it all. So profundity of interesting influences, of no doubt intense disappointment and great promise, and a lot that must be a little boring even to God. I don't know, but probably not really. Just all felt and incorporated into the self-composition of God. Because remember, this is a God who isn't static and always exactly the same. This is a God who is taking in every moment of a pulsating universe and is affected by it. So God, I hope this isn't too heretical, God is in a process of becoming with all that is becoming. God remains utterly faithful to God's self and to all of us. But God is not getting into self-contradiction in this view, but taking it all in, experiencing it, experiencing just the creative amazingness and everything else. Hartshorne even calls the universe the body of God. God feeling it all very immediately, but not controlling it all. So with God taking it in, both luring and taking in, there is a deep intimacy with the creation, and because there is desire for the good and the better, yes, one could say there's a romantic quality to that desire. I like that. I'll use that.
Wait.
So I had not heard of process theology either. So when I heard process theology, I went some analytical thing, And so I was very grateful for your definition, because to me now process theology is really this dance of becoming. It's the process of becoming. It's a dance of becoming. That's what process theology is, not this analytical head game, which I appreciate very much. So thank you for taking the time to define it.
I appreciate not just the appreciation, but your reformulation. Yeah, it is really about a process of becoming, and that is a becoming in relation, always. That's names it.
Not really a question, but a comment.
Okay.
But similarly to Jan, thank you for that definition of process theology, because process theology, we beat my ass in seminary. And so it beat my ass.
In seminary?
Yes, that was a tough, that was a tough week. So that was a very helpful, and I would say magical definition of process theology. So thank you.
All right. I never can take all.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you, but I also wanted to, I hadn't thought of anything else but the Genesis narrative of coming from an empty place. And then when you started talking, and of course it was helpful that Lee gave us like we're in a connect and care group with some of your pieces of your book. But then I started thinking about, even when people say they create from nothing, they really don't. But I've never thought about the fact it really isn't from nothing. There was something that an idea formed and then it became. So thank you, because I've always been under the understanding that it was void and empty, and then from nothing it happened, and then you started to talk about the second verse, and then I saw a link that I hadn't seen before. So I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, it just seems so important every now and then just to spiral back through that beginning point because of all of the unformed possibilities that we're dealing with and the positive potential and the negative potential. But to realize that is the process of creation. That is creativity in the divine life with the universe and in our lives. So we're not creating ever just from zilch, nothing. Now, the way to deal, so much Christianity assumes the creatio ex nihilo, the creation from nothing, but that I don't want to be just dismissive of it, like, oh, what a stupid mistake, or, oh, you're the real heretics with your ex nihilo. I'm sometimes tempted, but, you know, to say maybe if we can understand the nothing as the no thing, you know, no thingness. There weren't any things. Things are formed things. So that's a way of kind of compromising that it's a no thingness. Would you sing that verse again?
Nothing from nothing leaves nothing. You gotta have something if you want to be with me.
I might have to revise my Face of the Deep and quote you quoting that song.
Can we say thank you one more time to Dr. Keller?
Well, thank you all. Let's have more conversation.
Thank you, St. Paul and St. Andrew, for continually being agreeable to becoming, right? Next week, we'll gather after worship, and we're going to think about all of our liberation series, and we're going to think about how to think about it, right? It's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, so we got to think, and we got to process, and we got to pray, and we're going to have some time. Most of it will be just talking to each other about the things that have impacted us. And we'll get started in worship with that, and in our Connecting Cares, of course, but we'll also have 3 tiny testimonials, and you know how we love that. So come back next week. Thank you so much.